So we continue our conversation about the brain parts, and we covered the cerebrum, and now the next structure, we going from the parts of the brain responsible for the higher levels of control, higher levels of the brain function, to more and more visceral, more and more unconscious controls. Now we're going to talk about parts of the structure in the center, in the middle of the brain, that is called diencephalon. Diencephalon consists of three subparts: thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. And the thalamus is going to be the first one to converse. That's egg-shaped structure right here. You can see it. So it is located in between the hemispheres, and inside of it is the third nucleus. Third ventricle. If you would look at the structure of the ventricles on your tables, you will see third ventricle. It's right in the center, and the third ventricle is in the center of thalamus, and you can see thalamus, the cross section of it, in right above the brainstem. It consists of multiple nuclei, bilateral nuclei, okay? And the parts of the thalamus, two halves of the thalamus, are connected by the structure called interthalamic adhesion. You see interthalamic adhesion right here. If you would look at the models, or the models of the brain, or the models of the ventricles, for instance, in the model of the ventricle, you will see an opening, a hole in the third ventricle. That hole essentially corresponds to the interthalamic adhesion. The main function of the thalamus is the information relay. It's a stop for the information on its way to the cortex. And this information may come from various sources. Sensory information may come from special senses: eyes, ears, nose. From the sensory receptors in your body. It may be motor control information coming from cerebellum that is relayed through the thalamus. Does that make sense? Now, different nuclei in the thalamus have sort of specialization. You don't need to know, I'm not going to ask you, what's the main function of medial geniculate body, but I want rather illustrate it for you, that various nuclei may have the relay function over the motor controls coming from cerebellum, or integration of sensory stimuli coming from the body, or special senses, like this, parts of the thalamus controlling visual and auditory inputs. Some of them control mood and emotions and attention. So those multiple nuclei of the thalamus relay information on its way to the cortex. Another important function of the thalamus, think about this, it's sort of a relay and sorting facility. Impulses are sorted, some of them are sort of filtered out, and importantly, impulses that are functionally related are put in groups and pretty much sent to the relevant area of the brain. Say, what I mean by functionally related impulses. Think about this. Cerebellum, it's not a part of the cerebrum, but it's a part of the brain. It's a part of the brain located below, it's inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Is an important controlling organ of your motor activities. This control is subconscious. You're not aware about this control, but think about this. Cerebrum, in order to exert these controls, have to receive the enormous amount of information about your body position, about your motor activities, okay? And those sensory inputs that come from kinesthetic receptors in the joints, somatosensory receptors, vestibular apparatus in your inner ear. They all grouped together and channeled to the cerebellum altogether, because they are all relevant to a specific activity. They're functionally relevant. Does that make sense? Thalamus allows you to understand and appreciate and separate pleasant and unpleasant sensations, okay? And it also conveys the motor signals from cerebellum and basal nuclei to the motor cortices. So it is, in essence, a relay and sorting station. For instance, as I mentioned, sensory inputs will be sent through the thalamus to the cerebellum. Cerebellum will produce certain motor output, which then be sent through the thalamus to the motor cortices. Does that make sense? It's a relay station. Just below the thalamus, right here, is the structure that is called hypothalamus. Okay? It is a major controller of autonomic nervous system. What does autonomic mean? The word, generally, autonomic. And somebody is, I don't know, I travel autonomically. No? Auto means auto. Self. So autonomic, self-sustained, self-controlled. Does that make sense? Autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that you have absolutely no control over. Activities like digestive secretions, I don't know, blood sugar controls, a bunch of endocrine activities. You have no control over it. You cannot consciously increase your insulin or decrease your insulin. You cannot consciously increase your blood pressure or decrease your blood pressure. Those are autonomic controls, and hypothalamus is the main controlling organ. It sort of leverages its controls through the structure called, well, you cannot see it really here, but okay, you can see it here. That's a pituitary gland, okay? Pituitary gland that is connected to the hypothalamus versus the bridge that is called infundibulum. So hypothalamus, as I mentioned, since it's a controlling organ, it sends signals to pituitary gland, which controls endocrine system, and it also, and that we go into the area of hormones, that's totally different story, okay? And it also sends autonomic signals to the brainstem and the spinal cord, okay? For instance, your brainstem, parts of your brainstem participate in such important controlling responses as cardiovascular controls, heart rate, frequency of the contractions, respiratory rate. A bunch of autonomic reflexes are controlled by the brainstem. All of it is controlled over that by the hypothalamus. It's a major controller of the ANS. And essentially, hypothalamus is responsible to the responses to emotions. Remember we talked about it just like before the break about limbic system. How you experience certain emotion and your palms get sweaty, your heart rate goes up, you start to breathe faster. your appreciation of what you feel is the limbic system. It's association cortex, multimodal association cortex. Does that make sense? You can tell, oh, that is anger. That is positive excitement. But your physiological response to it is hypothalamus. Does that make sense? When you're nervous, before the important interview or talk, you may try to quench your, shaky hands, tremors, or, I don't know, that unpleasant feeling in the stomach, sweaty palms. You want it to go away. You want to control it, but you cannot. It's physiological response. Okay? It also controls a lot of basic body functions. For example, body temperature. Okay? Hypothalamus is your thermostat. Really. It controls food intake. Water balance. Sleep-wake cycles. And it's actually very, very interesting. An endocrine system. Now, if you would look at various structures, again, I'm not going to ask you nuclei of the hypothalamus, but paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei. They control water balance and produce such interesting hormone as antidiuretic hormone. Some people with the physical structural damage to hypothalamus develop a disease that is called diabetes insipidus. Has anyone heard of it? It's not the regular diabetes that we know of that's related to the blood glucose. No, it's a different type. Diabetes insipidus is characterized by inability to control urine production. Which means people with diabetes insipidus do not reabsorb the water in the kidneys because they don't have a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. Okay? So what these people make is enormous amount of very dilute urine. And they have unquenchable thirst. The amount of water that they consume a day may reach several gallons. Okay? But everything goes through because they don't reabsorb the water. Does that make sense? Hypothalamus also regulates the temperature. That's what we talked about. Okay? Okay. Important nucleus, suprachiasmatic nucleus, controls your circadian cycles. Along with purely nervous controls, the hormone called melatonin is involved in the regulation of the sleep-wake cycles. When you are in the bright light, nervous signals from your optic nerve reach suprachiasmatic nucleus and inhibit the synthesis of hormone called melatonin. You may have heard about it. When light is off, in the dark, there is no sensory input from optic nerves. Melatonin synthesis is not inhibited. Melatonin elevates and you fall asleep. When you travel in the plane over, the vast stretches, for instance, you go to a different hemisphere, you experience the jet lag. One of the ways to overcome the jet lag is to take melatonin. It will help you to fall asleep. It will help you to maintain your sleep-wake cycle, or at least, transition into the new daylight cycle easier. Also, you may have heard about the polar night and polar day that can be observed above the polar circle, up north, very up north. That's pretty much the situation when the day lasts for several months. There's no night. It's not always like day bright, but it's pretty bright. A friend of mine had a chance to live for 2 weeks in these conditions, and she said it was a nightmare because my watch says it's midnight and it's like day. So you don't know when to fall asleep. And your circadian rhythm goes completely bonkers, okay? Yes, they have that too. It's more than a month. Again, it's not a complete darkness. Sometime of the day it's complete darkness, and sometime of the day it's dark. Okay, very dark twilight. Let's put it this way. Another organ that produces melatonin to some extent is epithalamus. You can see it right here. Okay, it's a rather small structure, really small structure. Okay, on this picture, that's pretty much the epithalamus over here. Okay, the pineal gland in the epithalamus is a producer of melatonin. Interestingly enough, it produces melatonin mostly in kids, and it becomes fibrosed as we grow up. So we really don't know what importance of pineal gland is. Okay. Another very important function of hypothalamus is the control of appetite. Structural damage to hypothalamus can cause two extreme opposite disorders. One is hypothalamic obesity, when people cannot exert conscious control over eating. They don't have satiety. They don't feel satiety. Does that make sense? They don't. They may physically feel pain in the stomach, but like when you eat something, you need food. You don't really need to get like bloated to understand. I've eaten something, it's enough. I'm full. It's hormonal regulation that works through the hypothalamus. People with the structural damage do not feel full. Does that make sense? They're always hungry. On the opposite side, there is a condition called chronic wasting disease, in which people don't eat. So they have wasting of the body tissue. That's pretty much structural. I was at, listened to a talk. It was very complicated. The guy who studied regulation of appetite and weight gain by hypothalamus, and he proposed, there are so many drugs that influence that. We talked about it a little bit when we discussed neuropeptide neurotransmitters like CART, cocaine and amphetamine related transcript, that they can inhibit feeding. And he mentioned that, maybe agonists of certain receptors may work as the anti-obesity drug. And I sat there and thought, we have 200 people that talk how to fight obesity, and really the main way to fight obesity is stop eating and start exercising. Don't get me wrong, there are some people with genetic deficiencies, but mostly that's it. Midbrain. I apologize. It's a typo, I just noticed it. Okay, it's a typo. So we're going to talk about structures of the brainstem, and the first one is the midbrain. So brainstem is another level of CNS that is located between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. It consists of three parts. It's a midbrain that can be seen here and here. It's the medulla oblongata. If you would look at the models, you will see that the pons is right here, medulla is lower. You can see that bump. If you would look at the cross section of your models, there's a bump on the brainstem. It has some letter. Yeah. What letter is that? You see? Letter number. Yeah, maybe 6 or B. That protrusion, that's pons, and below pons is medulla oblongata. Okay, so these three parts are important controllers of visceral functions of various sorts. So they're sort of a second level of, let me show it to you. So here's what you see on your models. So that's pons, that's medulla, and that's midbrain. Can you find it now? Can you see it? Okay, pons, medulla, and the midbrain. They represent another level of control of autonomic nervous system. Pretty much hypothalamus communicates to them. Okay? That's sometimes they are called vegetative control organs because they control vegetative functions of the body. Things like heart rate or breathing rate. Okay? Structurally, if you will do the cross-section, the brainstem, you're going to see that cross-section consists of the gray matter nuclei that are surrounded by the white matter tracts. Gray matter, what does it consist of? Gray matter. Non-myelinated parts of the neuron, which part of the neuron is non-myelinated? Soma, right. And white matter tracts are axons, yes. So nuclei perform sort of integrative function. Okay? Brainstem is responsible for various automated behaviors. Vomiting, swallowing, control of the heartbeat and respiration, control of the urination and defecation. Okay, sorry, no defecation. Urination, yes, not defecation. Urination slightly different. Okay? Also the tracts between the spinal cord and the cerebrum, they go through the brainstem. And actually, 10 cranial nerves start in the brainstem. Okay? Does that make sense? You control different functions in your head. So, most superior part of the brainstem is the midbrain. So you can see it right here. It's around the cerebral aqueduct. So if you would look at the model of ventricles, you can kind of appreciate. Where's that? Okay. Three big parts. First, superior cerebellar peduncles. I love those names. So generally peduncles establish the communication between the brainstem structures and the cerebellum. So superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain to the cerebellum. It contains the fibers, so-called cerebellothalamic tract, which connects cerebellum to the thalamus and conveys the motor control inputs from cerebellum to thalamus. Another function of midbrain is the pain suppression. Gray matter that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct is responsible for the pain suppression. Structure called corpora quadrigemina, which can be seen here, is responsible for two very interesting reflexes. First, it's this reflex, auditory reflex. Okay, it wasn't loud enough, but that's auditory reflex. Any loud noise and you will look at it, startle reflex. Another is a visual reflex as following the moving object. If you ever see the tennis match or ping pong match, try to look at the spectators. If they show them up close, this is what spectators are going to do. They're going to follow the moving ball, okay? That's normal. This is how we survived. We followed with eyes, yeah, we followed the moving object. Okay, it's normal. Another important structure that can be found in the midbrain is the substantia nigra, which contains a bunch of dopaminergic neurons that transmit the signal using the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopaminergic neurons in this part of the midbrain control movements as well as planning of motor activities. Degeneration of dopaminergic neurons causes Parkinson's. Okay, so it's pretty clear. We know exactly what causes that problem. Now, pons and medulla are two structures that are lower. Okay, that's pons, located between the midbrain and medulla oblongata. On the lateral section, you can see that big blob right here is pons. If you would look at the model of the ventricles, you will see the fourth ventricle. So anterior to the fourth ventricle is pons, posterior is cerebellum. Fourth ventricle is between them. Okay. There are mostly fibers in the pons. Actually, from the Greek, pons means bridge, and it essentially bridges motor cortex and cerebellum via middle cerebellar peduncle. Pons also contains a respiratory center, but it's not the only controller of respiration. Medulla oblongata is no less important in regulating your breathing pattern. The most inferior part of the brainstem, medulla, that goes into the spinal cord, and partially it's anterior to the fourth ventricle, has several functions. Most important along of them, probably, visceral controls. Heart rate, blood pressure via vasoconstriction, force of cardiac contraction, respiratory rate, vomiting, swallowing are controlled by medulla oblongata. Along with that, it contains the point of decussation of pyramidal tracts. It's in the medulla where nerves that come from the brain, motor cortex, to the body cross over, and that's why right side of the brain controls left side of the body and vice versa. It's called just decussation point. They cross over in the medulla. That's location. Okay? Medulla is connected to the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and that's pretty important because all the proprioception, you know what proprioception means? We don't. Proprioception is a position, okay? Position in space. Proprioceptors detect the position in space. Proprioceptors are in your muscles and your joints. That's how we know that we do this, okay? That's proprioception. So this proprioception is conveyed, that's position in space, proprioception. Medulla conveys proprio impulses, okay, to the cerebellum, okay, and also conveys vestibular inputs to the cerebellum. Now these are tracts that are maintained between the medulla and the cerebellum. And actually, many names, it's really interesting. It would be interesting for you to come back after, let's say, we learn about cranial nerves and look at it again. Think about this. So, posterior spinocerebellar and cuniospinocerebellar are just proprioception, unconscious proprioception. It's unconscious only for one reason. Those signals do not reach your somatosensory cortex. Think about this. If any impulse, sensory impulse, doesn't get to somatosensory cortex. For you, it's never there. You see what I'm trying to say? If any sort of sensory input doesn't reach your somatosensory cortex, it's not there. You don't know about it. I mean, it happens. You just don't know about it. You're not aware of it. Okay? So that's an example. Trigeminocerebellar. Proprioception from the face. Trigeminal nerve is one of the major nerves, well, major sensory nerve that conveys sensory inputs from your face. Olivocerebellar. If movements go wrong. Vestibulocerebellar relates the information about balance. So kind of, if we will try to summarize the medulla, it's the visceral controls of various sorts and communication of proprioception and balance to the cerebellum. Does that make sense? Now, we're done for today.